The morning Lillian Grayson walked into Caldwell's dry goods store with her fist wrapped tight around 11 cents, every last penny she owned in the world. The sky over Dusty Creek, Texas, was the color of a wound that hadn't yet decided whether it would heal. It was the autumn of 1878, and the town of Dusty Creek sat at the edge of the Texas panhandle like a man who had given up looking for something better but hadn't quite sat down yet. The main street was a single ribbon of packed red dirt, flanked by a handful of weathered buildings that leaned into the wind, as though the plains had spent decades trying to push them somewhere else. There was Harlan's Saloon, which smelled of cheap whiskey and old regrets. There was the post office, which doubled as the barber shop and tripled as a place where men gathered to tell lies about the size of their cattle herds. There was the livery stable at the far end, run by a man named Otis who spoke only in grunts but whose horses were always the finest in 3 counties. And right in the middle, broad-shouldered and sun-bleached, stood Caldwell's Dry Goods, which sold everything from flour to horseshoe nails, from calico cloth to patent medicine that tasted like something had died inside the bottle. Lillian Grayson was 28 years old, and she carried herself like a woman who had once had the luxury of standing tall, and had not yet let herself forget how it felt, even now that the world had knocked the ground from beneath her feet. She was dark-haired, with a widow's black dress that had been washed so many times it had faded to a deep charcoal gray, the kind of color that made a woman disappear into a crowd if she stood still long enough. Her eyes were a complicated shade of brown warm when the light was right, fierce when the light was wrong, and rarely anything in between. She had been widowed 14 months ago when her husband, Thomas Grayson, had been thrown from a horse during a river crossing and drowned in less than 3 feet of fast-moving water. The cruelty of it, that a man could be taken by something so small when the world was full of larger dangers, had not stopped surprising her. It still arrived fresh some mornings, like a boot heel to the chest. Thomas had left her with the homestead, 40 acres of difficult land on the eastern edge of the Dusty Creek Basin, a mule named Jeremiah who had opinions about everything, and a debt to the First Bank of Wheeler County that was slowly swallowing the property whole. She had spent 14 months trying to outrun that debt, selling what she could, growing what the drought allowed, taking in mending work from the women in town who had husbands who could afford to pay her for the things they did not want to do themselves. But the summer of 1878 had been brutal. The creek had run low, the garden had scorched, and the bank had begun sending letters with increasingly formal language that meant they were no longer interested in patience. So Lillian had come to Caldwell's with 11 cents, because 11 cents was exactly the price of a small sack of cornmeal, which was the last item on her list of things she absolutely could not do without. She had counted the price 3 times on the walk into town, rolling each coin between her fingers, confirming the arithmetic with a quiet private certainty that was the closest thing to confidence she had left. She pushed through the door of the dry goods store and was immediately wrapped in the smell of the place cedar and tobacco and dried herbs, bolts of fresh cotton, the sharp mineral bite of nails in their wooden barrels. Mr. Caldwell was behind the counter, a wide man in his 50s with spectacles perched at the end of his nose and a perpetual expression of mild exasperation, as though the world were a book he had been reading for a long time and found largely disappointing. "Mrs. Grayson," he said, without warmth but also without coldness. It was the tone of a man who had extended credit before and regretted it. "Good morning, Mr. Caldwell," Lillian said, moving directly to the shelving where the grain sacks were stacked. She found the cornmeal, a small cotton sack sewn shut at the top, and carried it to the counter with the deliberate motion of a woman who had rehearsed this errand many times in her head. She set it down and opened her fist, spreading the coins on the worn pine surface. Mr. Caldwell looked at the coins. He looked at the cornmeal sack. He looked at his ledger book, which was lying open on the counter beside him, and his expression shifted into something Lillian could not quite read but understood instinctively was nothing good. "Mrs. Grayson," he said again, and this time the name carried weight. "I'm afraid the price on cornmeal went up last Thursday. Supply wagon came in short and the prices from Amarillo reflect the shortage. Cornmeal's 13 cents now." Lillian stared at him. She counted the coins on the counter with her eyes without moving them. 11. She was 2 cents short. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The store ticked and breathed around them, the creak of the building in the wind, the distant sound of a horse somewhere on the street, the dry whisper of the air through the ill-fitted window frames. Lillian felt the weight of those 2 cents like a stone placed precisely in the center of her chest. She picked up her coins. She put them back in her fist. She lifted the cornmeal sack from the counter and set it carefully back in its place on the shelf, with the kind of controlled gentleness that costs a person something. She turned around without a word, because there was nothing to say, and walked out of the store. The porch outside was wide and shaded, the boards gray with age and sun, and the street beyond it was full of the ordinary mid-morning life of a small western town. A woman crossing with a basket on her arm, 2 men arguing in front of the saloon, a boy chasing a dog around the hitching post. The world was happening, noisy and indifferent, and Lillian stood on the top step of Caldwell's porch and allowed herself exactly 3 seconds to feel every bit of what she was feeling. Then she squared her shoulders, lifted her chin, and began walking. She had made it perhaps 4 steps off the porch into the red dirt of the street when she heard the boards behind her creak under the weight of boots, and a voice said, "Ma'am, I think you forgot something." She turned. The man standing on the porch was not someone she recognized, which was unusual in Dusty Creek, where she knew most people at least by face. He was perhaps 30, 32 at the most, tall and broad through the shoulders in the way of men who worked with their bodies rather than simply owning the bodies of other men. He wore a canvas work coat, trail-worn but clean, and a hat with a crease down the center that had been shaped by weather and use into something that no longer looked exactly like any style in particular, but suited him perfectly. His eyes were a pale, clear gray, the color of the Texas sky in January, and they held an expression that was carefully neutral, not pitying, which Lillian would have recoiled from, and not condescending, which would have been worse. He looked at her the way a man looks at a situation he has just decided to involve himself in and is trying to be honest about his intentions. In his hand, held out toward her, was the sack of cornmeal. "I believe this is what you came in for," he said. His voice was low and even, the kind of voice that did not need to fill a room to be heard in it. Lillian did not take the sack. "I don't take charity," she said. The words came out flat and clear because she had long since learned that softening them only invited argument. "It isn't charity," he said. He came down the 2 porch steps into the street without haste, and she noted that he moved like a man who was comfortable taking up space in the world, unhurried, unafraid of it. "I was inside when Mr. Caldwell told you the price had changed, and I had been standing at the counter when he set those new prices this morning. Seems to me, if a man doesn't have his prices written down and posted where his customers can read them before they come all the way into town with exact change, that's a failing on the store's part, not a failing on yours." Lillian looked at him. She was trying to identify what he wanted, because in her experience no one did something for nothing, and she was too tired to pretend otherwise. "I've got 2 pennies right here," he continued, reaching into the breast pocket of his coat and producing the coins with a straightforward simplicity that was completely without theater. 2 cents to make up what the price jumped without warning. I'm not giving you the whole sack. I'm covering the difference the store failed to advertise. That seems like a fair accounting to me." Something in the way he framed it, as a matter of fairness and arithmetic rather than sympathy or generosity, moved a fraction of an inch past her defenses. She looked at the cornmeal sack in his hand and at the 2 coins in his palm, and she thought about the empty tin canister in her kitchen and the boy who had died in that river and the bank letters on her table, and she thought that a person could only be proud so far before it became something dangerous. "I will pay you back," she said. "No need," he said. "But if it would make you feel better to do it anyway, I'll not argue with you." She took the sack. She took it the way a person accepts a thing they have decided to accept, with both hands clearly, as though the accepting were a statement rather than a surrender. "I'm Lillian Grayson," she said. "Andrew Barlow," he said, and touched the brim of his hat with 2 fingers in a gesture that was simply polite, nothing more. Andrew Barlow had come to Dusty Creek 2 weeks before Lillian's visit to the dry goods store, though she had not been in town to notice his arrival. He had ridden in on a blue roan named Crockett, with a bedroll, a saddle bag, a Springfield rifle in the scabbard, and a wooden tool chest lashed behind the cantle, and he had tied up at the livery and asked Otis in simple language whether there was work to be had in the area. Otis had grunted in a way that Andrew had correctly interpreted as affirmative, and within 3 days Andrew had taken on a job as a general hand for the Rafter T Ranch, which was one of the larger operations in the county, and was currently in the process of building a new hay barn before winter arrived and made the project impossible. He was a carpenter and a ranch hand both, a man of multiple practical skills who had spent most of his adult life moving across the Texas Panhandle and into New Mexico territory and back again, following work the way water follows the easiest available grade. He was 31 years old and had been on his own since 17, when his parents' farm in central Kansas had been foreclosed, and the family had scattered like dandelion seed in a high wind. He had 2 brothers somewhere in Missouri and a sister in Colorado, and he wrote letters to all of them at irregular intervals, and received letters back at even more irregular ones, and this was a family arrangement he had made his peace with. He was not, by nature, a man who inserted himself into other people's affairs. He had learned early that the West was full of people trying to escape histories they did not wish to have discussed, and he respected that in others the way he wished it to be respected in himself. But there was something about what he had witnessed in Caldwell's store, the way Lillian Grayson had set that sack of cornmeal back on the shelf, with such careful, deliberate control, with such quiet refusal to let anyone see the cost of it, that had bypassed his general policy of non-interference entirely. He had acted before he had consciously decided to, which was unusual for him, and he was thinking about it still as he watched her walk away from him down the main street of Dusty Creek, with the cornmeal sack under her arm and her spine as straight as a fence post. He went back inside the store and finished purchasing his own supplies, a box of nails, a coil of wire, 2 cans of linseed oil, and when he came out and loaded his purchases into his saddlebag, he found himself watching the end of the street where Lillian Grayson had turned and disappeared, and thinking that he would like very much to see her again. He did not anticipate that the opportunity would come as quickly as it did. The Rafter T Ranch was 3 miles east of Dusty Creek, and the road that ran past its southern fence line was the same road that passed within half a mile of the Grayson homestead. Andrew had been riding that road for 2 weeks without knowing anything about the property he passed, but on the afternoon of the day he met Lillian in town, he was riding back to the ranch and he noticed, for the first time, the small farmhouse set back from the road with the failing garden plot in front and the mule tied in the yard and a woman on the roof. He pulled Crockett to a stop. The woman on the roof was Lillian Grayson, and she was clearly attempting to nail down a section of shingles that had pulled loose in a recent wind. She had the hammer, she had the nails, and she had clearly been doing it herself with a degree of success that was genuinely respectable. But the section she was working on was at the far edge of the roof slope, and she was reaching at an angle that any reasonable person could see was going to end badly, and as Andrew watched, her foot slipped. She caught herself. She grabbed the ridgepole with both hands and hung there for a moment against the pale afternoon sky, and Andrew was already off Crockett and moving toward the property before she had fully regained her footing. "I'm fine," she called down, having noticed him. There was a tightness in her voice that suggested she was aware of how close it had been. "I can see that," he said, shading his eyes to look up at her. "But I'm a carpenter, and I've got an hour before I need to be back at the rafter tea if you'll allow it. I'd rather do that corner section for you than spend the next hour worrying about whether I should have offered." She looked down at him from the roof for a long moment, her hands still on the ridge pole, her dark hair coming loose from its pins in the afternoon wind. "You work at the rafter tea," she said. "Just took on there 2 weeks ago. General hand, mostly barn building right now. Andrew Barlow. We met this morning." "I remember," she said, in a tone that suggested she was deciding something. "There's another hammer in the barn." He found the hammer where she said it was, and he climbed up, and together they worked the edge section of the roof in a silence that was not uncomfortable, handing nails back and forth, testing the boards, fitting the shingles flush and tight the way they needed to be to handle winter weather. He noticed that she knew what she was doing. She was not helpless on a roof. She was simply in a position that required someone to anchor the near end while the other person worked the far edge, and she had been trying to do both at once because there had been no one else to ask. That understanding settled into him quietly and without drama. When they climbed down, the sun was getting low and orange behind the flat rim of the plains to the west, and the mule Jeremiah was watching them both with an expression of deep skepticism. "He doesn't trust easily," Lillian said, nodding at the mule. "Neither do most sensible creatures," Andrew said. She looked at him. One corner of her mouth moved almost imperceptibly. It was not quite a smile, but it was adjacent to one, and he tucked that small fact away somewhere careful. "Thank you," she said. It came out plainly, without the stiffness of obligation, and he could tell it had cost her something different than the cornmeal had, not pride exactly, but perhaps a wall she had been maintaining that had briefly allowed someone to stand close to it. "The shingles will hold now," he said, which was the only response that seemed right. He rode back to the rafter tea in the golden last light of the evening, and he thought about her most of the way there. The weeks that followed moved the way autumn weeks do in the Texas Panhandle, quickly when you were not watching them, with a gathering cold that arrived in the mornings first and slowly claimed the afternoons. Andrew finished the hay barn at the rafter tea by the middle of October, and the foreman, a weathered man named Gil Stratton, asked him to stay on through winter as a general maintenance hand and to help with some fencing work in the spring. The pay was steady, and Dusty Creek was as good a place to be as any he had been in recent years, and so Andrew said yes. He saw Lillian again the following Saturday, at the weekly market that set up in the open lot beside the post office. She was selling jars of preserved tomatoes and dried herbs from a small table she had set up, and she was doing a modest but real business with the women of the town, who were practical people, and understood the value of preserved vegetables heading into winter. Andrew bought 2 jars of tomatoes that he did not strictly need, and paid the price she asked without negotiating, which in the West was always a form of respect. "You're going to eat a great many tomatoes," she said, wrapping the jars in a scrap of cloth. "I like tomatoes," he said. It was not entirely a lie. "Do you?" She handed him the package and looked at him with that careful, assessing quality her eyes had. "Or are you trying to be kind again?" He considered denying it, but he found he did not want to lie to her, even a gentle, harmless lie. "Both things can be true at once," he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Are you in Dusty Creek for long, Mr. Barlow?" "Looks like through the winter, at least. Rafter tea needs the extra hands." She nodded slowly, as though filing this information somewhere. "That's good," she said, and then she turned to a woman who had appeared beside the table to look at the herb packets, and Andrew stepped back and let her attend to her business, but he stood nearby for a while longer than he probably needed to. It was her neighbor, a woman named Ruth Delaney, who first said out loud the thing that several people in Dusty Creek had begun to think quietly. Ruth was a forthright woman of 45 who had survived a Comanche raid, 2 hard winters, and a husband who had been bitten by a rattlesnake and recovered, and she said what she thought because she had concluded life was too short for the alternative. She stopped by Lillian's table at the end of the market day when most people had gone and said, in the practical, unsentimental tone she used for all subjects, "That man Andrew Barlow has been to your table 4 times today and bought enough preserved tomatoes to last him through March." Lillian was folding her cloth and stacking her remaining jars. "He's a customer," she said. "He looked at you," Ruth said, "the way that creek looked at the land before it flooded in the spring of '74, with a kind of patient, inevitable interest." "Ruth," Lillian said, with a warning in her voice. "I'm not saying anything you don't already know," Ruth said, entirely unintimidated. "I'm just saying a woman who spends her nights worrying about the bank and her days doing the work of 2 people might consider allowing herself to notice when someone notices her." Lillian did not reply to this. But she thought about it on the walk home, carrying her folded table and her remaining jars through the cooling late afternoon, and she thought about gray eyes that were carefully neutral and yet somehow not empty of feeling, and she told herself she was being foolish, and then she thought about it some more. The bank letter arrived on a Wednesday in the 2nd week of November. It was not the first letter. It was not even the third. But this one was written in language that was unmistakably final, the kind of language that meant the patience of institutional creditors had reached its administered limit. The note, which was the sum of Thomas's original loan and 14 months of accumulated interest, was due in full by December 15th. The amount was $112. Lillian sat at her kitchen table and read the letter twice. Then she set it down and looked at the wall for a while. Then she picked up the letter and read it again, as though it might have changed. $112. She had $11.40 in the tin on the shelf above the stove. She had the mule, who was worth perhaps $15 if someone wanted him, and she was not sure she could bring herself to sell Jeremiah, who was difficult but familiar and had been the only other living thing in the house with her for more than a year. She had the 40 acres, the house, the small barn, and the tool shed, all of which the bank would take in settlement of the debt, which meant she would have nothing and nowhere. She was not a woman who cried easily. Thomas's death had taught her, through the long education of grief, that tears were something you spent and did not get back, and she had been careful with them since. But sitting at that kitchen table with the bank letter on the pine boards in front of her, she put her face in her hands and gave herself 5 minutes. Then she blew out a long breath, stood up, and began thinking about what could be done. She was at this calculation going over figures she had already gone over, looking for solutions she had already not found, when she heard a knock at the door. It was a sound that surprised her, because visitors to the homestead were rare, and she was not expecting anyone. She tucked the bank letter under the breadboard on the counter before she answered the door, which was a reflex she was not entirely proud of but could not seem to stop. Andrew Barlow was standing on her porch with a load of firewood under each arm, stacked so high he could barely see over it. "I was splitting wood up at the rafter tea today," he said, his voice coming from somewhere behind the logs, "and the stack got ahead of what they'll need before spring. Gil told me I could take some of the surplus. I thought you might could use it." She stepped back and let him in, and he carried the first load to the box beside the stove and went back out for a second, and then a third. And by the time he was done, there was enough firewood stacked in her front room to see her through January with some measure of comfort. He stood in the middle of her kitchen brushing wood chips off his coat, and she stood on the other side of the table and thought about the bank letter under the breadboard. "You look like something's troubling you," he said. He said it matter-of-factly without pressing, the way you might remark on a change in the weather. "I'm fine," she said, which was the answer she always gave and which she suspected he already knew to evaluate accordingly. He looked at her. He didn't argue. But he didn't look away either, and there was something in the steadiness of his gaze that made the reflexive armor feel, for a moment, more like a prison than a shield. She pulled the bank letter out from under the breadboard. She set it on the table between them. She was not entirely sure why she did it, only that there was something about Andrew Barlow that made her tired of pretending things were different from what they were. He picked it up and read it without speaking. His expression did not change in any dramatic way, but his jaw tightened slightly and she saw him calculate. December 15th, he said. Yes. How much do you have? $11.40. He set the letter down and was quiet for a moment, and she could see him thinking, turning options the way a man turns a piece of wood in his hands to find the grain. The rafter tea paid me my first month's wages last week, he said. $28. I've got some savings from the last job in New Mexico, not a great deal, but some. No, she said immediately, absolutely not. I haven't said anything yet. You were about to offer me money, she said, and the answer is no. I will not take a loan from a man I've known for 6 weeks. I will find another way. He looked at her steadily. I know you will, he said, and there was no condescension in it, no performance of patience. He simply believed it and said it as plainly as he might say the sky was clear. But if another way becomes impossible to find, I want you to know the offer exists. Because a bank taking a woman's home over a debt her dead husband left behind is not justice, and I'm not inclined to stand by and watch injustice happen when I can do something about it. Lillian sat down. She sat down because her legs had gone a little uncertain beneath her, not from weakness, but from the impact of being seen in a way she had not expected. The specificity of what he had said, not her debt, but her dead husband's debt, which was a distinction no one else had bothered to make, struck somewhere deep and unguarded. It isn't simple, she said after a moment. Nothing worth having ever is, he said. She looked at him across her kitchen table with the winter light coming through the small window above the washstand, turning his profile into something quiet and golden, and she felt something shift inside her that she had been carefully holding in place for 14 months. She did not say anything about it, but she felt it, and she knew it for what it was. Over the following 2 weeks, Andrew came by the homestead regularly. He told himself, and anyone who asked, that he was checking on the repairs. The roof needed weather sealing at the joints. The barn door had a hinge that was working loose. The steps on the back porch had begun to rot at one end and needed replacing before someone went through them. These were all true things, and they were all things he attended to with genuine care and skill. But he also stayed for coffee when she offered it, and then for supper when she insisted, and the conversations that happened across her kitchen table in the evenings after the fire was built up and the lamp was lit were the kind of conversations that go somewhere. She told him about Thomas, not the whole of it, not all at once, but pieces of it, and he received each piece the way a careful man receives something fragile, with both hands, with attention, without making it about himself. Thomas had been a good man, she said. Not a perfect man, but good at the root. He had brought her from Missouri to Texas with promises about land and a future, and the land had been real even if the future had not worked out the way either of them had planned. She did not say she was sorry he was gone, because grief was not made of apologies, but she said she missed the ordinary things most, the sound of his boots on the porch in the evening, the way he could fix almost anything except the things that mattered, the particular companionship of having someone who knew your silences. Andrew listened to all of it and did not try to fill the spaces with reassurance or perspective, which was its own form of gentleness. He told her things about himself in return, about Kansas, about his parents' farm, about the years of moving work to work across the Southwest. He told her about the loneliness of it, which was something he had not said out loud to anyone in longer than he could remember, and saying it surprised him. It surprised her too, he could tell, not because it was unexpected that he would be lonely, but because he said it plainly, without shame, which was not how men usually spoke about such things. "You're not what I expected," she said one evening, after he had said something she had not anticipated. She was warming her hands around a coffee cup, her feet tucked up beside her in the kitchen chair in the way she did when she was comfortable, which he had noticed was something she only did when she forgot to maintain her careful distance. "What did you expect?" he asked. She thought about it honestly. "Someone who wanted something," she said. "People don't usually do things for nothing. I kept waiting to find out what you wanted." And now, she looked at him, and there was something naked and considering in her eyes, something that had stopped trying to be armored. "Now I think maybe you're just a man who wants to be where he is and isn't hiding anything about it." "That's accurate," he said. "That's rare," she said. He looked back at her across the table, and the fire was going and the lamp was lit and the wind was doing its old Texas thing outside the walls, pressing against the house like it wanted to get in, and he said, "I want to stay in Dusty Creek." "You've said that, through winter at least." "I mean after," he said. "I want to stay. I'm not sure how to be less clear about it than that." She was quiet, but she did not look away, which he took to mean something. "There's the matter of the bank," she said finally. "There is," he agreed. "But that's a practical problem, and practical problems have practical solutions." $112, she said. "I know the number," he said. "I've been thinking about it." She set down her coffee cup. "Andrew, hear me out," he said, leaning forward on his elbows, and the quiet directness in his voice made her listen. "I talked to Gil Stratton at the Rafter Tea. There's a cattle drive heading to Dodge City in the spring, a big one. The kind that pays serious money for extra hands with the right skills. I could take that work and have the note cleared by April." "That's after December 15th, she said. "I know. Which is why I also talked to Judge Farley." She blinked. "You talked to Judge Farley about my bank note?" "I talked to him in general terms," Andrew said carefully. "About foreclosure law in Texas, and whether there are provisions for extension on homestead properties for widows. And there are, Lillian. There's a Texas homestead protection statute. It's not widely advertised by banks because it cuts against their interest, but a widow on her primary homestead has the right to petition for a 90-day extension before a foreclosure can be executed. The bank has to accept the petition if it's properly filed." Lillian stared at him. "I didn't know that." "The bank was counting on you not knowing it," he said, without particular heat but with certainty. "Judge Farley knows the statute. He said if you come to his office with the letter and the original deed and file a proper petition, the bank has no legal choice but to hold off until at least March. That gets us past winter. That gets me to Dodge City and back." The word "us" had entered the sentence quietly, but they both heard it. She looked at him for a long time. The firelight was doing something complicated with his face, softening the hard, weathered angles of it, filling in the particular kind of tiredness that a man carries when he has been moving alone for a long time and wants very badly to stop. "Why?" she said. It was the most direct question she had asked him, and it had the directness of something that mattered. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said, and then, after a pause, more quietly, "and because I have not stopped thinking about you since the morning you walked out of Caldwell's store carrying exactly nothing and holding your head like you were carrying the whole world." The silence that followed was the kind that is full rather than empty. The fire popped. Outside, the wind moved through the dry grass of the plains with its cold, infinite patience. "Andrew," she said. "I know it's soon," he said. "I know there's 14 months of grief and 40 acres of hard land, and a bank trying to take your home standing between where we are and anything else. I'm not asking for something immediate. I'm asking for permission to try." She looked at him. She thought about Thomas, and she thought about loneliness, and she thought about the way this man had stepped off a porch behind her with 2 pennies and a sack of cornmeal, and something in his manner that was entirely without performance. She thought about gray eyes and careful hands, and the way he had listened to her without flinching when she talked about the hard things. "You have permission," she said, "to try." He let out a breath that he had perhaps been holding for several weeks. They went to Judge Farley's office the following morning, and Lillian filed the petition, and the judge confirmed what Andrew had described. The bank was required by Texas homestead statute to hold its proceedings for 90 days once the petition was properly filed and acknowledged. Mr. Harmon at the First Bank of Wheeler County was not pleased about this development. as Lillian could see clearly when she walked into his office to deliver the petition's notice. But he could not argue with a filed legal document, and he accepted it with the pressed smile of a man storing a grievance for later use. December arrived in Dusty Creek with a genuine severity, the first real cold of the season sweeping down out of the north with a wind that had no obstacles between it and the Arctic. The ground froze. The creek contracted to a thin, bright thread between ice-rimmed banks. The townspeople moved with the particular purposefulness of people who have learned from hard experience that winter in West Texas is not a metaphor. Andrew was at the rafter tea through the weeks, maintaining buildings, repairing storm damage, helping with the winter feeding of the cattle herd. But he came to the homestead on every Sunday and on some Saturday evenings besides. And the ritual of it, the knock, the door opening, the warmth inside began to feel like something that had always been there, like a room he had only recently found the key to. Christmas came quietly. Dusty Creek marked it modestly. There was no great abundance of decoration or celebration in a town that was still young enough to be preoccupied with survival. But the church put up a wreath and held a service, and Ruth Delaney organized a small community dinner in the meeting hall where people brought what they had and shared it at long tables. Lillian brought 3 jars of preserved peaches and a pan of cornbread, and Andrew brought a haunch of venison that he had dressed himself. They sat at the same table at the dinner, which the town registered and remarked upon in the mild, speculative way that small communities remark upon such things. On Christmas afternoon, after the dinner, Andrew walked Lillian back toward the homestead in the thin, pale winter light, Crockett tied at the hitching post a few yards behind them. The street was quiet. Most people had gone home to their fires. He pulled a small wrapped parcel from inside his coat and held it out to her. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I wanted to," he said. "Open it." She unwrapped it carefully. It was a small wooden box, hand-carved, smooth as silk under her fingers, with a simple pattern of leaves and vines worked into the lid. The workmanship was exquisite, detailed and patient in a way that made her understand it had taken a long time. "You made this," she said. "It was not a question." "In the evenings," he said, "I had the right piece of cherry wood." She ran her thumb over the carved vine on the lid and her throat tightened. "It's beautiful," she said, and the word was inadequate, but she could not think of a better one. "There's something inside," he said. She opened the lid. Inside the box, on a small square of clean cloth, were 2 pennies. She looked up at him. "The 2 cents from Caldwell's," he said. "The way you said you'd pay me back, I want you to keep them instead, so you'll always have more than you did that morning." She was quiet for a moment that stretched and breathed. And then, before she had entirely decided to do it, she stepped forward and kissed him, a brief, certain, entirely deliberate press of her lips against his jaw, because she was close and his face was right there, and the afternoon light was very fine and she was tired of holding the distance. He went very still. And then his hand came up and touched her face, just her jaw, with a gentleness that was almost frightening in a man his size, and he turned slightly so that when she drew back just an inch their eyes were level. "Lillian," he said. "I know," she said. "I need you to know that I mean everything I've said." "I know that too," she said. He kissed her then, properly, his other hand finding the small of her back with a certainty that said he had thought about it. And the wind moved through Dusty Creek around them with its old cold business, and neither of them paid it any attention at all. January passed in the grip of the cold, and February brought a thaw and then another freeze, and through all of it the shape of what was happening between Lillian and Andrew became clearer and more settled. The way a creek finds its bed after a flood, not by force but by nature, seeking the lowest and most natural course. He proposed to her on a Friday evening in late February, not with great ceremony but with complete seriousness. He was sitting at her kitchen table after supper, and she was washing the dishes at the basin, and he said, without preamble, "I want to marry you. I want to be honest with you about what I can offer and what I can't, and I want you to be honest with me about whether you want this. So I'm asking." She kept washing the dish in her hands for a moment, Then she set it down and dried her hands on her apron and turned around. "What can you offer?" she said. Not as a challenge, but as a genuine inquiry, because she was that kind of woman. "A pair of good hands and a steady disposition," he said. "I'm not a rich man and I'm not a famous one. I've got my wages and my savings and the promise of the cattle drive in the spring, which should clear your bank note. I can build things and fix things, and I'm not afraid of hard work. I've been alone long enough to know I'm better with you than without, and I mean to spend a good long while proving that if you'll let me." She looked at him. She thought about the wooden box with the 2 pennies inside, which was on the shelf above the stove next to the canister where she kept her money. She thought about roof shingles and firewood, and the way he had read the bank letter with his jaw tight and gone out, and found a solution instead of offering sympathy she did not want. She thought about the way he said her name, not as a syllable of address, but as though it meant something to him, as though saying it were a small act of pleasure. "Yes," she said. "I'll marry you, Andrew Barlow." He stood up from the table and crossed the kitchen and took her hands in his, and his grip was warm and steady, and she felt something inside her settle into a place it had not occupied for a very long time. They were married on a Saturday in March, in the Dusty Creek Church, with Reverend Calhoun officiating in the manner of a man who found weddings the genuinely agreeable part of his vocation. Ruth Delaney stood up for Lillian, which suited everyone, because Ruth would not be moved once she had decided to do something, and there was no one who could object to her presence without embarrassing themselves. Gil Stratton stood up for Andrew, largely because Andrew had asked him, and Gil was the kind of foreman who became a friend without anyone formally deciding that it happened. The wedding was not elaborate. There were wildflowers on the church sill, early spring ones that Lillian had gathered that morning from the edges of the property where they came up first. And there was a dinner afterward at Ruth's house with all the neighbors who came. And there was good food and some fiddle music that appeared at around 7 in the evening in the form of a man named Potts who played anything anyone asked him to. And when Andrew danced with Lillian in Ruth Delaney's front room to something slow and sweet that Potts found somewhere in his repertoire, the people around them had the decency to be interested without being obvious about it, which was the highest social achievement of the Texas Panhandle. Andrew danced with his wife with the same quality of attention he gave everything complete, unhurried, present. His hand on her back was the hand of a man who had made a decision and was entirely at peace with it. "Are you happy?" he asked, quietly so only she could hear. "Yes," she said, and she said it the way she said everything important plainly without decoration as a true statement of fact. "Good," he said. "So am I." The cattle drive south from the Rafter T to Dodge City was arranged for the second week of April, and Andrew left on a Monday morning in a group of 12 men, all of them riding out in the early gray light with the herd moving slow and enormous ahead of them across the flat plains. Lillian stood on the porch and watched them go. She had known men who rode away and did not come back, and the old familiar tightening was there, the one she recognized from the last years of Thomas's life, when the land and the debt and the distance between them had felt like its own kind of departure. But this was different, and she knew it was different, and she told herself she knew it was different every day for the 6 weeks he was gone. He wrote to her from every town that had a post office between Dusty Creek and Kansas, which was not many but was more than nothing. The letters were practical in the way Andrew was practical. They told her things clearly, without sentimentality about what the drive was like, what the weather was doing, how the herd was moving, whether the other hands were the kind of men who could be relied upon. But each letter ended with 2 or 3 sentences that had nothing to do with cattle, sentences that were plain and warm and without any self-consciousness at all, and those were the sentences she read first. He was back in Dusty Creek in the last days of May, rode dusty and sunburned and leaner than he had left, with $143 in a canvas pouch in his saddle bag. He rode directly to the bank from the edge of town, and he paid off the note on the Grayson homestead in full, and he watched Mr. Harmon stamp the paper paid with an expression that was as satisfying as anything he could remember. And he took the stamped deed and the satisfaction home to his wife. Lillian was in the garden when he rode in. The spring garden had survived the winter and was growing now with the kind of determined energy that always followed a difficult season, and she was on her knees in the dirt pulling weeds when she heard Crockett's hooves on the road and looked up. She stood. She pulled her garden gloves off as she crossed the yard, and she met him at the gate, and when he got down from the horse she wrapped her arms around him with the sudden unself-conscious fullness of someone who had been waiting for that specific moment to arrive and was glad it had. "The note is paid," he said, holding her. She pulled back enough to look at his face. "All of it. Every cent." Here, he took the stamped deed from inside his coat and gave it to her. She looked at it for a long time. The paper was worn at the folds from years of being held and re-examined by worried hands, and the paid stamp was dense and black and absolute. She folded it again carefully and tucked it against her chest. "Thank you," she said. "Your house," he said. "Or ours, I suppose, if you'll have me living in it." "I will," she said. "I absolutely will." The summer of 1879 was better than the one before. The rains came with some regularity that year, and the garden grew with a generosity that felt almost personal, as though the land were making up for past failures. Andrew worked at the rafter tea through the summer but came home each evening, and the routine of it, the boots on the porch, the supper together, the long conversations in the cool of the evening, settled around them like something solid and reliable. They worked the homestead together in a way that multiplied what either of them could have done alone. Andrew repaired and improved every structure on the property with the quiet, systematic attention of a man who builds for the long term. He put a proper foundation under the barn and replaced the rotting boards in the back porch, and installed a better wood stove in the kitchen that heated the whole house more efficiently. Lillian expanded the garden and began selling produce and preserved goods with real success, establishing a regular arrangement with 2 of the restaurants in town and a standing order with Ruth Delaney, who had strong opinions about preserved peaches. In September of that year, Lillian told Andrew she was expecting a child. He had been at the kitchen table, going over some accounts, when she said it, and he looked up at her with an expression that started as surprise and resolved very quickly into something she could only describe as joy. Not the performance of joy, not the expected response, but genuine, uncomplicated delight that took over his face, the way sunlight takes over a room when a curtain is pulled back. He stood up from the table and came around it and held her, and she felt his exhale against her hair, long and warm and full of something that had been waiting. "Are you well?" he said. "How do you feel?" "Tired," she said honestly, "but well." "Whatever you need," he said. "Tell me what you need." "I need you to stop looking at me like I'm made of glass," she said, pulling back to look at him. "I'm not fragile, I'm just going to have a baby." He laughed, a real one, the kind that started in his chest and was entirely unpremeditated. She had always loved his laugh, which appeared without warning and was never calculated. "Fair enough," he said. Their son was born in the last week of May 1880, which meant he arrived with the wildflowers and the long spring light, and they named him James, after no one in particular, but because it was a name that felt like itself, solid and unadorned. He was a healthy boy with Lillian's dark hair and Andrew's light eyes, and the general disposition of someone who had decided the world was interesting and intended to investigate it thoroughly. He slept badly for the first 3 months and then with spectacular reliability after that, and this was taken by both his parents as evidence of a fundamentally sound character. The homestead expanded in the year following James's birth. Andrew added a bedroom to the house and improved the kitchen, and together they put in a larger root cellar for the winter stores. Ruth Delaney came over most Sundays and was an unofficial aunt to James from approximately the 3rd week of his life, which suited everyone except possibly James, who was subjected to Ruth's thorough and entirely unsentimental opinions about proper child development from an extremely early age. The autumn of 1880 brought a change in the town of Dusty Creek as well. The railroad had been moving steadily westward across the Panhandle, and there was now serious conversation about a line coming through or near the town, which would change everything: the economy, the population, the character of the place. Andrew sat with the other men at the meeting the town held about the railroad and listened to the arguments for and against, and afterward he told Lillian his thinking. The railroad would come whether they wanted it or not, and the question was whether the town was ready to absorb the change and remain itself, or whether it would be overwhelmed and become something that no longer had the qualities that made it worth staying in. "Is it worth staying in?" she asked. "For us it is," he said. "We've built something here. I'm not inclined to lose it." She looked at him across the supper table, with James asleep in the next room and the lamp lit between them, and she felt the fullness of what they had built together, which was not only the house and the garden and the cleared debt but something less tangible and more lasting, a shared understanding of what they were and what they wanted, a companionship that had been tested by grief and want and distance and had only gotten more certain under the pressure. "Then we stay," she said. "Then we stay," he agreed. There was a period in the winter of 1881 when things were not easy. Lillian's mother, who lived in Missouri, fell ill, and the uncertainty of distant worry, the letters that took weeks to arrive and to answer, the inability to know in real time whether things were better or worse, wore on Lillian in a way that Andrew could see clearly but could not resolve, which was its own kind of hard. He did what he could, which was to be present and steady, and to drive her to the telegraph office in the county seat when the situation required faster communication than the post. Her mother recovered slowly over the winter, and by spring the letters were warmer again and the weight lifted. It was during that winter of waiting and uncertainty that Andrew said something to Lillian that she thought about often in the years that followed. They were sitting by the fire late one evening, James asleep, the cold pressing against the windows, and she was quiet with worry in the way she went quiet when things were beyond her reach to fix, and Andrew said, "You know something I've learned about you." "What?" she said. "You carry everything alone by default," he said. "Even when there's someone right here to help you carry it, you have to override yourself to let it be shared." She thought about it. "I know," she said. "It's a hard habit to break." "You've been getting better at it," he said. "Since the cornmeal," she looked at him. "Since the cornmeal. That was the first time," he said. "When you took the sack and said you'd pay me back, something shifted in you right there and I saw it. You've been working on it ever since." She was quiet for a long moment. "You've been watching me very carefully for a very long time, Andrew Barlow." "I have," he said without any apology for it. "That could be alarming," she said. "Is it?" She leaned over and rested her head against his shoulder, which was a thing she did now without thinking about it, which was itself a kind of answer. In the spring of 1882, Lillian discovered she was expecting again. James was 2 years old and walking with the confident recklessness of a person who had recently discovered legs and was not yet entirely trustworthy with them, and the prospect of a second child was met with the same feeling as the first, a kind of settled, practical joy that had no interest in complicating itself unnecessarily. Their second child was a daughter, born in October 1882, and they named her Clara. She arrived with a fine quantity of Andrew's pale gray eyes and Lillian's stubborn temperament, which was immediately apparent and entirely charming, and she occupied the household with the gravity of someone who understood from the beginning that she had arrived somewhere important. By the mid-1880s, the Grayson homestead, which Andrew and Lillian had officially renamed the Barlow property, though it would always be the Grayson homestead to the older residents of Dusty Creek, had become a real working farm. The 40 acres were producing. Andrew had built a proper workshop on the property and was doing carpentry work independently, in addition to his occasional work at the rafter tea. He made furniture, built houses for new arrivals, repaired wagons and barns and equipment, and his reputation spread through the county as a man whose work was done right the first time. Lillian's preserved goods business had grown into a small but genuine enterprise. The bank debt was a distant memory. The property was theirs, entirely and legally and without condition. Ruth Delaney, who had never married but had opinions about everyone else's marriages that were on the whole charitable and largely accurate, said at one of her Sunday suppers with Lillian and Andrew, and the children, that she had never in her life seen two people who were more fundamentally suited to each other than Lillian and Andrew Barlow, and that she was pleased to have witnessed the whole thing from the beginning, including the cornmeal incident, which she had heard about in detail from 3 different people, including Caldwell himself, who had apparently felt some retrospective guilt about the price change. "I didn't think anything of it at the time," Lillian said. "You thought plenty of it," Ruth said. "You just didn't say so." "That's her way," Andrew said, with a smile that had grown comfortable and deep over the years of using it. "I was cautious," Lillian said. "You were frightened," Ruth said, which was the kind of thing only Ruth could say. "You had been hurt and you were frightened, and you had every right to be. And then this man stepped off a porch and offered you 2 pennies, and the rest is what it is." She gestured at the table, at the children, at the lamplight and the full plates, and the accumulated evidence of a life that had been built from less than nothing, and had become something real and lasting. Lillian looked at Andrew. Andrew looked at Lillian. There was between them, in that look, everything that had been said and everything that had not needed to be said, the whole accumulation of shared mornings and difficult winters and easy summers, the children and the work and the conversations by firelight that had gone on long past the time either of them had meant to stay up. There was the roof and the cornmeal and the bank letter and the 2 pennies in the carved cherry wood box, which was still on the shelf above the stove where it had always been. There was the cattle drive and the stamped deed, and the wedding in the church with the early wildflowers on the sill. There was every morning that he had come home and every evening that she had waited, and the way those mornings and evenings had added up into a life that neither of them, in their most careful and honest private moments, had been entirely sure they would get. It was a look that lasted about 3 seconds and contained approximately 40 years' worth of meaning. "Pass the biscuits," Andrew said to James, who was 7 now and took bread requests with enormous seriousness. "Yes, sir," James said. Clara, who was 4 and had her mother's opinions about everything, announced that she wanted more gravy. "Ask properly," Lillian said. "Please, may I have more gravy?" Clara said, with the precise intonation of someone who found "please" and "thank you" an unnecessary bureaucracy, but was willing to comply. Ruth Delaney laughed, and Lillian laughed, and Andrew Barlow sat at the head of his table in the house he had helped build on the land that was now truly theirs, and felt the kind of contentment that does not announce itself because it does not need to. The years continued to be kind to them in the way that years are kind to people who do not waste them. Dusty Creek grew slowly, as the cattle trade matured, and the railroad spur that finally arrived in 1884 brought new people and new commerce. The town built a proper schoolhouse in 1885, and James was in the first class of students who attended it, taught by a young woman from Ohio, named Miss Patterson, who had clear and democratic opinions about education, and who James initially regarded with suspicion and later with the devoted respect of a student who has been genuinely challenged by someone who believed in him. Andrew became a respected figure in the town in the quiet way that useful men become respected, not through proclamation or position, but through the accumulated weight of being reliable. When the church needed a new roof in 1886, Andrew organized and led the building effort, and when a family named Kowalski arrived from Kansas in the winter of 1887 with nothing but a wagon and determination, it was Andrew who rallied the community to help them build shelter before the cold made it impossible. He did not make speeches about any of this. He showed up with tools and expected others to do the same. Lillian, for her part, became something of an anchor in the community of women, which was its own distinct and important ecosystem in any frontier town. She was not given to sentiment or easy comfort, but she was honest and she was present. And in a world where many women were isolated by geography and circumstance, the fact that Lillian Grayson Barlow would come when she was needed and say true things rather than comforting ones turned out to be a quality of immense value. She helped 3 different women navigate the difficult bureaucracy of legal and property matters after their husbands died, drawing on her own experience with the bank note and Judge Farley's office. She made it her business, quietly but deliberately, to know what the Homestead Protection Statute said, and to make sure the women of Dusty Creek knew it too. James grew into a young man with his father's steadiness and his mother's sharp eyes, and at 14, he was helping on the property with a competence that was genuine and unsentimental. He had inherited Andrew's facility with wood and tools, and by 15 was helping his father on carpentry jobs, learning the craft with a natural aptitude that Andrew recognized and was careful not to overpraise, because overpraise was the fastest way to interfere with something genuine. Clara grew into a person of remarkable intelligence and somewhat spectacular determination, who at 12 had opinions about everything from the running of the household, to the management of the farm, to the question of whether women ought to be permitted to own property independently in Texas, which she had looked up and had strong views about. She and her mother had arguments that were the best kind, substantive, respectful, and productive, and Andrew presided over these exchanges with the expression of a man who is deeply entertained, but knows better than to say so. On a spring evening in 1889, when the light was long and golden over the Texas Panhandle, and the plains were doing their brief, extravagant annual thing with wildflowers and new grass, Andrew and Lillian sat on the front porch of the house watching the sun go down. James was at the barn with Jeremiah's successor, a mule named George who was only slightly less opinionated than the original. Clara was inside doing something with a book that she would not allow anyone to interrupt. The evening was quiet in the way of evenings that have earned their quietness. "Do you remember the morning?" Andrew said. She looked at him. She knew which morning. "Yes." "I didn't think about it as a decision at the time," he said. "I just moved. I was off that porch before I decided to be." "I know," she said. "I was watching." "Were you?" "From the moment I turned around," she said. "You were so matter-of-fact about it. 2 pennies and a sack of cornmeal like it was the most ordinary thing in the world." "To me it was," he said. "It seemed obvious." "Nothing about that morning was obvious to me," she said quietly. "I thought I was going home empty-handed. I thought the world had confirmed what I had begun to suspect, that there was nothing and no one left in it that was going to give a widow a break of any kind." She paused. "And then you stepped off that porch." He reached over and took her hand. His hands were still the same, calloused and capable, warm, entirely certain of their intentions. "I'm glad I moved fast," he said. "So am I," she said. The sun went further down. The sky turned the colors it turned in that part of Texas in that season, orange and copper, and a deep spreading violet at the top that was different from the color of any other sky in any other place. The plains stretched out around them in every direction, flat and enormous and indifferent to the small warm light in the house behind them, to the children inside, and the mule at the barn, and the 2 people on the porch holding hands in the last of the evening. Dusty Creek had grown enough by 1889 that there was a real Main Street now, with a proper general store that posted its prices on a board outside. The dry goods business had changed. Caldwell had retired and sold to a man who ran things with more transparency, and the days of prices changing without notice were behind them. Lillian went to the store now without exact change, or with more than enough, or without thinking about it at all, because the world had changed and she had changed with it, and the 11 cents that had once been everything she owned was now a number so small it barely registered. But she kept the 2 pennies in the wooden box. She kept them on the shelf above the stove, exactly where she had put them the Christmas he had given them to her, and she knew exactly where they were without looking, and there were mornings when she passed the shelf and touched the box without opening it, just touched it. The way you touch something you want to confirm is still there. It was there. It had always been there. In the late summer of 1889, Lillian discovered she was expecting their third child, which surprised them both given that James was 9 and Clara was almost 7, and they had not been expecting to revise their calculations. But the surprise resolved quickly into the same settled, practical joy as before, and Andrew dealt with the news in the same way he had dealt with all the news of his adult life, with complete attention and no drama about it. Their third child was a son, born in April 1890 in the same season as James, which seemed right. They named him William, which was the name of Andrew's father, who had died in Kansas when Andrew was 19, and the naming was simple and unremarked upon, but carried weight that both of them understood. William arrived healthy and loud and immediately interested in the world, and James, who was 9 and had the proprietary feeling of a firstborn about his position in the family, received his younger brother with careful consideration, and then decided definitively that he was acceptable. Clara took one look at her new brother and announced that she was going to teach him everything he needed to know. Andrew looked at Lillian over Clara's head. Lillian looked back at him. Neither of them doubted that Clara would try. The house in those years was full in the way that houses with children are full, not only with bodies and noise, but with the particular kind of aliveness that children generate, the way they make the ordinary world strange and interesting again, by not yet knowing it is supposed to be ordinary. Andrew and Lillian moved through their days with the efficiency and complementarity of people who had learned each other's rhythms over years and no longer had to think about the coordination. They disagreed sometimes, the way honest people disagree, and they argued occasionally, the way people who are fully present with each other argue, and they resolved things the way they had always resolved things, by being direct, because both of them were too honest to manage the alternative for long. There was an evening when James was 17 and beginning to talk about whether he might go to study in Amarillo, the larger city that had grown to real significance with the railroad. Andrew and Lillian sat with him at the kitchen table and talked it through, and Lillian watched her husband listen to their son with the same quality of attention he had always given her, complete and unrushed, asking questions that actually mattered, helping James think rather than thinking for him. She thought, watching them, that this was what she had not known she needed in a partner, not someone who made things easy, but someone who made things real. Someone who was present for the actual business of living, not the performance of it. James did go to Amarillo to study when the time came, and he apprenticed with an engineering firm there, and he wrote home regularly with the same mixture of practicality and warmth that was his father's gift and had become his own. He came home for Christmas and summers, and each time he came home the house absorbed him back as though the absence had not happened, which was the sign of a home that knew what it was. Clara, at 16, informed her parents that she intended to become a teacher, citing Miss Patterson as her model and the education of the Panhandle's children as her vocation. Lillian did not express surprise because nothing about Clara's direction surprised her, only the velocity of it. Andrew said simply, "Good. You'd be a fine teacher," which was all Clara needed from him because she had always known he meant what he said. William, the youngest, was still in school himself when Clara was making these pronouncements, and he had the youngest child's genius for observation. He watched his parents and his siblings and the world with a quiet, careful attention that people mistook for shyness until they spoke to him and discovered he had been thinking about something very precisely for quite some time. By the time the century moved toward its close, Dusty Creek had become a real town, with a bank that was run honestly, a school that was well attended, a doctor who had come in 1886 and stayed because the town convinced him to, and a community that had the particular resilience of places that have survived enough hardship to stop being surprised by difficulty. The Barlow property was a good farm, worked well, owned free and clear, with a house that had been built and repaired and improved by hands that knew what they were doing, and a history contained in its walls that was neither dramatic nor famous but was entirely, completely true. Andrew Barlow was 53 years old on the evening that Lillian asked him what he thought about when he thought about his life. They were on the porch again, as they so often ended up, the way people who love a particular view return to it without deciding to. The sky was doing its thing with the colors, and the plains were exactly themselves, and the house behind them was warm with lamplight, and the sound of William practicing something on the harmonica he had taken up the previous summer with a seriousness that was endearing given how early in the process he still was. "I think about mornings," Andrew said. "I think I've been luckier in mornings than most men." Mornings specifically. She said, "The morning I rode into Dusty Creek," he said. "The morning I walked into Caldwell's store and happened to be standing at the counter when the prices changed. The morning I saw you on the roof trying to do two people's work at once. The morning James was born. The morning the bank note came back paid." He was quiet for a moment. "And every morning since that started the same as the one before it, which is the luckiest thing of all." Lillian looked at him in the fading light. He had lines at the corners of his eyes that had not been there when he first came off that porch with his 2 pennies and his matter-of-fact decency. And his hair had gone silver at the temples, and his hands were more worked than they had been. And he was entirely himself, more completely himself perhaps than any person she had ever known. And she loved him with the particular quality of love that comes from having been fully seen by someone, and finding that they stayed. "I was so afraid," she said after a moment, "that morning at the store, not about the cornmeal, about everything, about what was coming next and whether I was going to be able to manage it." "You managed it," he said. "We managed it," she said. He squeezed her hand. William hit a wrong note on the harmonica and produced a sound that startled a bird somewhere in the yard. They both laughed. The last of the light was going, the plains going from gold to gray to blue, and the first star appeared above the flat line of the horizon. They stayed on the porch for a while longer, the way they had learned to stay in moments that were worth staying in, not rushing toward the next thing, comfortable with the weight of the present, which was a skill they had both worked at and both achieved, and which was perhaps, in the end, the most valuable thing either of them had ever built. The house was lit behind them. Their youngest son was inside, working at something with the dedicated imprecision of someone learning. Their oldest son was in Amarillo, making a life that had grown from the one they had given him. Their daughter was teaching the children of the county things she believed they needed to know, which was exactly what she had said she would do. The property was theirs. The debt was gone. The 2 pennies were in the box on the shelf above the stove. Andrew stood after a while and offered her his hand to help her up, because that was something he had always done, a small and consistent courtesy that had never once felt like anything other than genuine. And she took it, because that was something she had learned to do, to take what was genuinely offered, to trust the weight of it, to stop looking for the hidden condition. They went inside together, and the door closed behind them, and the light in the windows of the Barlow property made a warm and particular square against the vast dark of the Texas Panhandle night, a small and solid and entirely sufficient answer to the endless indifferent plains, proof of nothing more and nothing less than the fact that 2 people had found each other, had chosen each other, had built something together that the wind and the years and the bank and the grief and the distance had not been able to take apart, which, when you thought about it carefully, was everything.